There were some people in the village of Rose Hill who maintained that nothing truly unexpected had happened there since the winter of 1926, when old Mrs. Pettigrew's cow had wandered into the vicarage dining-room during the Christmas luncheon. Others claimed that the arrival of the railway extension in 1938 had constituted a genuine upheaval. But the majority agreed that Rose Hill was, and had always been, a place where life arranged itself into pleasant and predictable habits. The village itself lay in a fold of the Kent countryside, with narrow lanes bordered by hawthorn hedges and cottages whose gardens overflowed with delphiniums and late roses. The church of St. Jude's stood on a slight rise above the green, its square Norman tower visible for miles around. Near it sat the Fox and Lantern public house, the post office, and two little shops that sold nearly everything and never precisely what one required. On the afternoon of the Harvest Benefit Fête, Rose Hill was enjoying one of those mellow September days that seemed touched with gold. Children ran shrieking across the green while trestle tables groaned beneath sponge cakes, jars of preserves and pyramids of seed cakes wrapped carefully in greaseproof paper. Miss Jane Marple sat in a wicker chair beneath the shade of a chestnut tree beside the vicar's wife. "I always think village fêtes reveal character better than almost anything else," Miss Marple observed mildly, adjusting the lace at her wrist. "People become extraordinarily determined over coconut-shy competitions." Mrs. Finch gave a nervous little laugh. "Well, dear Miss Marple, I do hope there won't be any unpleasantness today." "Unpleasantness?" said Miss Marple. "Oh, only that Colonel Bryce and Mr. Harbury have not spoken civilly in months, and Mrs. Wexford insists the flower committee deliberately excluded her dahlias." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Dahlias can produce very violent emotions." Mrs. Finch blinked, uncertain whether this was a joke. The fête spread before them in cheerful confusion. The church choir was attempting a musical performance near the bandstand with varying success. Elderly ladies in sensible hats poured tea with military precision. Young Peter Crammond, home from school, was cheating outrageously at the hoopla stall. Miss Marple noticed many things. She noticed that Dr. Lionel Harbury, the village physician, looked unusually strained despite his smooth professional smile. She noticed that Evelyn Bryce, daughter of Colonel Bryce of Rose Hill Manor, kept glancing toward the churchyard gate as though expecting someone. And she noticed that Mr. Percival Wexford, the church warden, avoided looking at his wife altogether. Most people would not have noticed such things at all. Miss Marple did. The church bell rang at 4:30. It was an old bell, deep-toned and resonant, and the sound drifted lazily over the fête. Conversation paused momentarily out of habit. Then the bell rang again, not unusual in itself perhaps, except that the second toll came after a curious pause, and with an odd unevenness, as though struck by uncertain hands. Miss Marple looked up. Across the green she saw the vicar emerging hurriedly from the church porch. At the same moment a scream cut through the pleasant afternoon. Several teacups shattered. People turned all at once toward the church tower. Young Elsie Morton, the verger's niece, came stumbling down the church steps, white-faced and breathless. "There's someone up there!" she cried. "In the bell tower, oh my God!" For one suspended instant nobody moved. Then the crowd surged. Bryce pushed forward first, broad-shouldered despite his age. Dr. Harbury followed quickly. Several men hurried into the church while frightened speculation broke out instantly among the villagers. Mrs. Finch pressed a hand to her chest. "How dreadful!" Miss Marple rose rather slowly from her chair. Her movements were unhurried, but her pale blue eyes had sharpened considerably. Inside St. Jude's Church, the coolness smelled faintly of candle wax and damp stone. Voices echoed upward into the tower staircase. Miss Marple did not attempt the climb immediately. At her age, steep medieval stairs were no trivial matter. Instead, she remained near the nave, observing those descending. Evelyn Bryce appeared first. She looked deeply shaken. "Miss Bryce," said Miss Marple gently, "are you unwell?" Evelyn swallowed. "There's a man up there." "Yes, dear." "He's dead." That single word traveled rapidly through the church. The villagers gathered in whispering clusters beneath stained-glass saints, while somewhere above, feet moved heavily across ancient boards. Then Dr. Harbury descended. His face had altered into professional gravity. "I'm afraid," he announced, "that Mr. Adrian Bell has been killed." A murmur rippled outward. "Adrian Bell? The historian fellow? The one staying at Belcroft Cottage? Good heaven!" Miss Marple knew of Adrian Bell slightly. He had arrived in Rose Hill 3 months earlier to catalogue records connected with St. Jude's Church and several nearby estates. A quiet man in his early 40s, scholarly and reserved, he had nevertheless become an object of curiosity in the village. Outsiders always did. Bryce came down next, red-faced and angry. "Police have been sent for," he barked. "Nobody is to leave." That naturally ensured everyone immediately wished to. Miss Marple sat quietly in one of the pews while excitement mounted around her. People always revealed themselves after a shock. Mrs. Wexford began loudly recounting how suspicious she had found Adrian Bell from the first. Young Peter claimed he had seen someone lurking near the graveyard the previous evening. The vicar worried about scandal. Mrs. Finch fluttered anxiously over everyone. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" asked the vicar absently. "The bell. The bell. It rang twice." The vicar stared. "Well, naturally it was struck accidentally during the disturbance." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, but she did not sound convinced. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, but she did not sound convinced. Inspector Daniel Graves arrived from Medchester shortly before 6 o'clock. He was a capable man in his 40s with brisk manners and a tendency toward premature conclusions. Miss Marple had encountered his type before. The body remained in the bell chamber. Inspector Graves questioned witnesses methodically, while villagers lingered nearby, pretending not to listen. "It appears," he said later, "that Mr. Bell suffered a fatal blow to the head, likely sometime between 4 and half past." "With what?" asked Colonel Bryce. "A heavy object. We shall know more after examination." "Robbery?" "No sight of it." Miss Marple listened from a distance while knitting placidly. Inspector Graves eventually approached her with polite skepticism. "I understand you were present at the fete, Miss Marple." "Jane Marple." "Ah, yes. Colonel Bryce mentioned you. That was kind of him. You observed nothing unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Well, Inspector, villages are full of unusual things if one notices them properly." He smiled faintly. "Yes, but anything specifically connected with the deceased?" "I noticed he seemed anxious earlier this week." "You spoke with him?" "Only briefly. He asked rather a great many questions about old parish records." Inspector Graves made a note. "Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated. "The bell rang twice." He looked mildly surprised. "Yes, I've heard several people mention it. But church bells are rather particular things," Miss Marple said softly. "One becomes accustomed to their character." "I'm not sure I follow. The second toll sounded wrong." Inspector Graves gave the indulgent smile frequently bestowed upon elderly ladies. "I expect panic makes people imagine oddities." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It very often does." But inwardly she thought, "Number, not panic, something else." By evening Rose Hill had transformed utterly. Curtains twitched in cottage windows. Conversations lowered as people passed in lanes. Lamps glowed behind drawn drapes while speculation spread with astonishing speed. At the Fox and Lantern, theories multiplied beside pints of bitter. It was robbery. "No, political business. I heard he was blackmailing someone. They say Colonel Bryce argued with him last week. Dr. Harbury was the last person seen with him." Rubbish. Mrs. Wexford knew him better than she admitted. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat beside her fire at Rose Cottage with a tray of weak tea untouched beside her. Her nephew Raymond had once said that his aunt's mind resembled a particularly deadly filing cabinet. At present that filing cabinet was opening methodically. Adrien Bell, the bell tower, the second toll, and something else. She remembered suddenly the expression on Evelyn Bryce's face before the scream, not surprise, but fear. Fear of expectation. Miss Marple threaded another piece of wool carefully through her fingers. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same everywhere. A little vanity, a little greed, a little cruelty, and occasionally murder. Outside, the village clock struck 8. Far away across Rose Hill, the bell of St. Jude's began to toll slowly into the dark. Miss Marple listened very carefully indeed. By breakfast the following morning Rose Hill had achieved that peculiar state common to English villages after catastrophe. An appearance of complete normality overlaid with concentrated excitement. Milk bottles still stood beside garden gates. Curtains were drawn back precisely at 8 o'clock. Mr. Tibble swept the pavement outside the post office with solemn dedication. Yet behind every ordinary action lurked anticipation. People wished to discuss the murder. More importantly, they wished to discuss it before anyone else did. At Rose Cottage, Miss Marple sat near the window with her tea-tray and a slice of toast growing steadily colder, while Florence, her devoted if outspoken maid, delivered the morning intelligence. "Well," Florence declared, "Mrs. Pritchard says the police were at Belcroft Cottage till nearly midnight, and they've taken away papers in 2 whole boxes." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple. "And Mrs. Wexford claims Mr. Bell had enemies in London." "Mrs. Wexford generally believes everyone has enemies." Florence sniffed approvingly. "That's true enough. Oh, and young Elsie Morton says she heard shouting in the church tower before the bell rang." Miss Marple looked up. "Did she say whose voices?" "She couldn't tell. Only a man and a woman, she says." "That's interesting." Florence lowered her own voice dramatically. "Between ourselves, miss, I never trusted that Dr. Harbury—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Florence, one should never trust appearances entirely pleasant or unpleasant." Florence accepted this with the air of someone who considered it unnecessarily philosophical. After breakfast, Miss Marple put on her dark hat with the violets and set out slowly for the village. Rosehill Green appeared deceptively peaceful beneath pale autumn sunshine. A few children chased hoops near the War Memorial. The fair tables had been removed, though scraps of coloured bunting still fluttered from the trees like remnants of a celebration abruptly abandoned. Outside the post office, small knots of villagers lingered with transparent purposelessness. Miss Marple paused beside Mrs. Bantry, who was engaged in acquiring stamps while extracting information from the postmistress. "My dear Jane," said Mrs. Bantry at once, "have you heard? Inspector Graves believes Mr. Bell knew his killer." "That seems very likely, and apparently there was no sign of forced entry to the tower." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Well, strangers rarely climb church towers for innocent reasons." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "There's another thing. Dolly Wexford says Adrian Bell had been examining old family records connected with Rosehill Manor." "You think that important?" "People are very sensitive about old family matters," said Miss Marple quietly. That was certainly true of Colonel Bryce. The colonel himself emerged at that moment from the solicitor's office across the lane. Tall, military, and silver-haired, he possessed the sort of commanding presence that made weaker personalities instinctively retreat. This morning he looked tired. He removed his hat stiffly. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry." "Colonel," said Miss Marple gently, "this must be very distressing for everyone at the Manor." He frowned. "A damned unpleasant business. You knew Mr. Bell fairly well?" "Barely at all." "Fellow asked too many questions." "What sort of questions?" The colonel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Historical nonsense. Estate matters. Family records." He gave a short dismissive laugh. "Antiquarians are pests." Yet Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around his mouth. Before she could speak further, Evelyn Bryce appeared from the direction of the church path. She looked pale, but composed in a navy coat and gloves. There was something striking about Evelyn's beauty precisely, though many men called her beautiful. Rather it was her stillness, her air of watching life from a guarded distance. "Father," she said quietly, "Inspector Graves wishes to speak with you again." The colonel muttered something under his breath. As he moved away, Evelyn remained awkwardly beside Miss Marple. "You were very kind yesterday," she said suddenly. "My dear child, anyone would have been distressed." Evelyn hesitated. "People are already talking terribly." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Villagers always do. I suppose they'll suspect everyone before it's over." Miss Marple looked at her carefully. "Is there someone you fear they may suspect?" For an instant Evelyn's composure slipped. Then she smiled faintly. "I expect we all fear that now." She walked away quickly before Miss Marple could reply. And again Miss Marple noticed that undercurrent of fear, not grief. Inspector Graves established himself temporarily in the small room adjoining the vicar's study, where villagers were summoned one by one for questioning. The queue outside became, naturally, a social event. Mrs. Wexford emerged first, flushed with excitement and importance. "I told the inspector everything," she announced loudly. Her husband Percival winced. "My dear." "Well, someone must assist the police." "What exactly did you tell him?" asked Mrs. Bantry curiously. "Mrs." Wexford lowered her voice theatrically while ensuring everyone could hear. "That Mr. Bell and Dr. Harbury argued near the churchyard 3 days ago." This spread instantly through the assembled listeners like spilled ink. At precisely that moment Dr. Harbury himself arrived. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with calm grey eyes and the reassuring manner cultivated by successful physicians. Yet today there was a tautness beneath his professional composure. "Good morning," he said evenly. Several villagers responded with uncomfortable enthusiasm. Mrs. Wexford smiled too brightly. "Inspector Graves wishes to see you, Doctor." "I'm aware of it." As he passed Miss Marple, he paused briefly. "Distressing business." "Yes, indeed. Though I expect the police will sort matters out quickly." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. Something flickered in his expression. Not guilt exactly, annoyance. "Do you disagree?" "My dear Dr. Murder is rarely quick to explain itself." He studied her a moment longer before entering the vicarage. "Mrs. Bantry whispered immediately. He looked nervous." "Most people do when accused of murder," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Bantry stared. "You think they suspect him?" "My dear, they suspect everybody." And that, Miss Marple knew, was perfectly true. The first real shock arrived shortly after luncheon. Inspector Graves requested the villagers' attention outside the church gates, where a considerable crowd gathered at once despite pretending reluctance. The inspector removed his gloves deliberately. "Following evidence uncovered this morning," he announced, "we have reason to believe Adrian Bell was involved in a serious dispute with another resident of Rouse Hill shortly before his death." A murmur swept through the crowd. "We have also established," Graves continued, "that Mr. Bell intended to publish certain information regarding financial irregularities connected with church restoration funds. This caused immediate sensation. Percival Wexford turned white. As churchwarden, he had overseen the restoration accounts. Mrs. Wexford gasped loudly enough for half the village to hear. "That's absurd!" Inspector Graves remained unmoved. "Mr. Percival Wexford," he said firmly, "I must ask you to accompany me." For one terrible second nobody spoke. Then the whispers erupted. Percival Wexford looked utterly shattered. "I never harmed the man," he stammered. "We'll discuss that at the station." Mrs. Wexford burst into tears instantly. "This is disgraceful." Percy would never. But the damage was done. As Inspector Graves led the trembling churchwarden away, the villagers watched with avid fascination barely disguised as horror. Miss Marple alone remained very still, because something about it troubled her profoundly. Not merely the arrest itself, the timing. Too neat, she thought, much too neat. That evening rain drifted softly across Rose Hill. Miss Marple sat with Lucy Bantry beside the drawing-room fire at Gossington Hall while the conversation revolved inevitably around the murder. "They've found discrepancies in the church accounts," Mrs. Bantry said. "Apparently quite substantial ones." "Percival Wexford always was careless," Miss Marple murmured. "But murder?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stirred her tea gently. "Lucy, have you ever noticed how people often prefer a simple explanation? Of course, it comforts them." Mrs. Bantry regarded her sharply. "You don't believe Wexford did it?" "I believe," said Miss Marple carefully, "that frightened people sometimes behave oddly, and guilty people sometimes behave calmly. One must be cautious about both." Rain tapped softly against the windows. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Then what troubles you?" Miss Marple looked into the fire. "The bell." Again that silence. "My dear Jane, surely not that again." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "That again." "That again." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "That again." She folded her hands. "The second bell sounded wrong because it was not accidental." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple spoke almost absently now, as though arranging pieces within her mind. "Suppose someone rang it deliberately after the murder. But why? To create confusion about time, perhaps, or to suggest panic, or simply because they wished everyone below to look upward at precisely the right moment." Mrs. Bantry stared. "Good heavens!" "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes had become distant. "And there is another thing." "What?" "The killer New Village habits." Outside, thunder murmured faintly across the countryside. Miss Marple added softly, "Because only someone familiar with Rose Hill would know exactly what happens when a church bell rings unexpectedly." Rain continued through the night, and by morning Rose Hill seemed wrapped in a grey stillness that deepened the village unease. Water dripped steadily from gutters. The gravel paths along the green glistened darkly beneath the low autumn sky. Miss Marple disliked damp weather for her rheumatism, but she disliked unanswered questions considerably more. At 10:30 she set out for Belcroft Cottage. The little house stood beyond the churchyard lane beneath a row of ancient yews. It was a narrow Georgian cottage with ivy climbing one wall and a neglected herb garden now overtaken by late nettles and rain-heavy lavender. A constable stood near the gate. He looked doubtful upon seeing Miss Marple approach, but not sufficiently doubtful to prevent her entry after she mentioned Inspector Graves' name with quiet confidence. Inside, Belcroft Cottage retained the peculiar atmosphere left behind when a solitary person dies suddenly. The room still held the shape of Adrian Bell's existence books stacked beside chairs, spectacles left upon a table, an unfinished letter lying near the hearth. Inspector Graves emerged from what appeared to be the study. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised. "I didn't expect—" "No," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "People rarely do." To his credit, he smiled. "I suppose you've come to investigate." "Oh, no, Inspector. Merely curiosity. That can be more dangerous." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very often." He gestured reluctantly toward the study. "We're nearly finished here." The room itself was crowded with papers and parish maps. Adrian Bell had evidently worked methodically. Files were arranged in neat bundles tied with string, each labeled carefully in a precise scholarly hand. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the room. She noticed the missing spaces first. Several drawers had been emptied hastily. Someone had searched here before the police arrived. Inspector Graves followed her gaze. "We believe the deceased was examining old financial records connected with church repairs and certain estate matters. And you think Mr. Wexford killed him because of that?" "It's a strong possibility." Graves regarded her thoughtfully. "You disagree?" "My dear Inspector, I merely observe that people who embezzle church funds are not invariably murderers." He laughed shortly. "Sometimes they are." "Indeed. But one must distinguish between weakness and violence. They are not always companions." The inspector crossed to the desk. "We found this hidden among Bell's papers." He handed her a folded page. It contained only a few handwritten lines. "Midnight Bell proves it." She knew. "Ask Bryce about 1919. Miss Marple read it twice. "How curious! You see the significance?" "Perhaps." Graves frowned slightly. Bryce admitted Bell questioned him repeatedly about events after the Great War. Apparently something occurred involving the Manor estate. Miss Marple handed back the paper. "And the phrase Midnight Bell? We assume it refers to church records. But you are not certain." "No." Miss Marple moved slowly toward the window. Outside, beyond the rain-speckled glass, St. Jude's tower rose above the yew trees. "The bells ring every quarter hour at night?" she asked suddenly. "And have done for many years?" "So I'm told." Miss Marple nodded faintly to herself. Then her attention shifted. Near the fireplace stood a pair of muddy boots, very muddy. But the rain had only begun late yesterday evening. Those boots, she thought, had collected mud earlier, before the murder. "Inspector," she said mildly, "did Mr. Bell often walk across the lower fields?" "The lower fields?" "Toward Rose Hill Manor." Graves looked surprised. "As a matter of fact, yes. Several villagers mentioned seeing him there recently." "How interesting!" "Because the lower fields were not the pleasant route to the manor. They were isolated and hidden." As Miss Marple left Belcroft Cottage, she encountered Dr. Harbury coming up the lane. He removed his hat politely. "Miss Marple." "Doctor?" For a moment neither spoke. Rain drifted softly between the hedgerows. Then Harbury said abruptly, "You don't believe Wexford is guilty either?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear doctor, I make it a rule never to believe anything too quickly." He studied her with tired eyes. "The police think Bell uncovered financial fraud. And perhaps he did. But—" Harbury hesitated. "He was digging into other things as well." "What sort of things?" The doctor glanced toward the churchyard. "Village history, old scandals, family matters. People dislike old scandals being disturbed." "Exactly." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "You sound almost sympathetic." "I am," he said sharply. "Rose Hill survives because certain things remain buried." That was an interesting choice of words, buried. He seemed aware of it immediately and gave an impatient sigh. "You must forgive me. None of this has been pleasant." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Murder rarely is." Harbury looked as though he wished to say something more. Instead, he only nodded and walked on toward Belcroft Cottage. Miss Marple remained standing beneath her umbrella for several moments. There had been genuine strain in the doctor's voice, but not fear for himself. Fear for someone else. But not fear for himself. Fear for someone else. By afternoon the village had divided itself neatly into factions. One group believed Percival Wexford unquestionably guilty. Another insisted he was too timid to commit murder. A third considered Dr. Harbury suspicious. Mrs. Wexford believed everyone part of a conspiracy. At the tea-room beside the post office, Conversation reached remarkable levels of invention. "I heard Bell discovered hidden debts at the manor." "Nonsense. It was blackmail." No, he had a lady involved." "Which lady?" "That's what nobody knows." Miss Marple listened quietly while stirring her tea. Beside her, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Do you think there was a woman?" "My dear, there is almost always a woman somewhere in village trouble." "Evelyn Bryce, perhaps?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she said, "People often mistake reserve for innocence." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, merely true." At that moment the bell above the tea-room door jingled. Evelyn Bryce entered. Conversation faltered almost imperceptibly. She carried herself calmly, but Miss Marple noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the posture of someone enduring scrutiny. Evelyn approached their table. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" "Of course, dear." Mrs. Bantry tactfully discovered an urgent need for more tea-cakes elsewhere. Evelyn sat down opposite Miss Marple. For several seconds she seemed unable to begin. "Do you think Mr. Wexford killed Adrian Bell?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Do you?" Evelyn looked away. "I don't know what to think any more. That is often the wisest position." A faint smile touched Evelyn's mouth before vanishing. "Mr. Bell came to the manor 3 times this month," she said quietly. "He asked father questions about my mother." Miss Marple became very still. "Your mother is dead?" "She died in 1919. "Was her death unusual?" Evelyn hesitated too long. Outside, a cart rattled past in the lane. Inside the tea-room, nobody appeared to listen, while everybody listened intently. "What sort of questions did Mr. Bell ask?" Miss Marple said gently. "He wanted to know about the church bell." Again the bell. "Why?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around her gloves. "Because my mother died the night it rang at midnight." Miss Marple said nothing. Evelyn lowered her voice further. "There was an accident at Rose Hill Manor after the war. At least, everyone called it an accident. And you do not believe it was?" "I don't know." The strain in her face was suddenly painful to see. "Mr. Bell believes something had been hidden. And what did your father say?" "He ordered him never to return." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yeah, that sounds rather like Colonel Bryce." Evelyn leaned forward suddenly. "Miss Marple, if someone discovered a terrible thing years later, something that could destroy people, would murder be possible?" "My dear child," said Miss Marple quietly, "people have killed for far less." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Then she stood at once, as though frightened by her own questions. "I shouldn't have said anything." "Nonsense." But Evelyn was already moving toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back once. "The bell rang twice that night, too," she whispered. Then she was gone. Miss Marple sat motionless. The room around her faded into murmurs and teacups. A midnight bell, a hidden scandal, and now another death. Very gently Miss Marple placed her spoon upon the saucer, because for the first time since the murder she felt certain of one thing. Adrian Bell had not died because of church accounts. He had died because he discovered what really happened the night the bell rang at midnight. The rain cleared during the night, leaving Rose Hill washed pale beneath a cold blue sky. Water still clung to the hedgerows and sparkled upon spiderwebs stretched across garden gates. By 9 o'clock the village had resumed its endless circulation of rumour. Percival Wexford remained at the Medchester police station for questioning, though not formally charged. This detail, insignificant in itself, produced entirely opposite interpretations depending upon whom one consulted. Mrs. Pritchard declared it proved the police were building a stronger case. Mr. Tibbles insisted it meant they've got nothing at all. Mrs. Wexford announced dramatically to anyone within hearing distance that her husband was the victim of persecution. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat in her drawing-room with a plate of untouched toast and a small black notebook open upon her lap. She was making one of her lists. Miss Marple believed firmly in lists. Human beings, she often reflected, behaved with remarkable similarity to village gardens. Left unattended, everything spread into confusion. But a little order revealed useful patterns. She had read 1919, Midnight Bell, Mrs. Bryce's death, Adrian Bell investigating, Fear not grief. Below that she added quietly, Who still remembers? A knock sounded at the front door. Florence entered looking faintly scandalized. "Inspector Graves to see you, miss." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "How nice." The inspector removed his hat as he entered. "I hope I'm not disturbing you?" "My dear inspector, old ladies are never disturbed, only interrupted." He gave an unwilling smile. I thought you might be interested to hear we've released Wexford temporarily. Indeed, there's insufficient evidence to hold him." Miss Marple nodded as though this were perfectly expected. Graves eyed her suspiciously. "You seem unsurprised. People who steal money often confess quickly under pressure," she observed. "People who commit murder usually do not. That's a neat distinction. It is frequently accurate." The inspector moved restlessly toward the window. "We searched Bell's cottage thoroughly this morning. We found references to a woman named Clara Bryce, Colonel Bryce's wife. Apparently Bell believed her death in 1919 may not have been accidental." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "What sort of accident was it?" Graves hesitated. "She drowned. In the river?" "In the ornamental lake at Rose Hill Manor." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. "How very unusual." "Why unusual?" "My dear Inspector, women rarely drown in ornamental lakes unless there is a reason." He looked amused. "You speak from experience?" "From observation, which is much more reliable." Graves sat down opposite her. "There's more." Bell interviewed several elderly villagers recently. He became convinced there was some connection between Mrs. Bryce's death and the church bell ringing unexpectedly at midnight. Miss Marple said softly, "The bell rang twice." Inspector Graves stared. "How did you know that?" "Because Evelyn Bryce told me." "Miss Bryce has said very little to the police?" "That is often true of frightened people." Graves frowned. "You really think she's frightened?"
"Oh, yeah."
"Of whom?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the inspector. "That," she said, "is precisely the interesting question." Rose Hill Manor stood half a mile beyond the village, surrounded by great beeches now beginning to bronze with autumn. Miss Marple arrived shortly after luncheon in response to an invitation from Evelyn Bryce herself. The manor possessed the melancholy grandeur of houses built for larger families and happier certainties. Portraits lined the walls. Clocks ticked solemnly in distant corridors. Everything smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Evelyn received her in the morning room overlooking the lake. Miss Marple noticed the lake immediately. It stretched beyond the lawns beneath drooping willows, dark and still beneath the pale sky. A deceptively peaceful place to die. "You wish to speak with me?" Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn nodded. "I thought perhaps I should tell someone the truth." "My dear, truth is very often healthier than secrecy, though less comfortable." Evelyn gave a strained little laugh. "You sound like my mother." "Then I should consider it a compliment." For a moment silence settled between them. Then Evelyn crossed slowly to the window. "I was 5 when Mother died," she said. "I remember almost nothing clearly. Only fragments." "What sort of fragments?" "The bell." Evelyn's voice lowered. "And people arguing." Miss Marple remained quiet. "Father always said Mother slipped while walking near the lake after returning from the church." Evelyn clasped her hands tightly together. "But the servants used to whisper." "About what?" "That she and Father quarreled terribly that evening." "And did they?"
"I think so."
Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Why has this troubled you particularly now?" Evelyn turned suddenly. "Because Adrian Bell said my mother may have discovered something." "What sort of thing?" "He wouldn't tell me directly, only that the answer lay in the church records and the bell tower. Again the bell tower. Again the records." Miss Marple's mind moved delicately among possibilities. "Did Mr. Bell mention anyone else connected with this?" Evelyn hesitated. "Dr. Harbury's father." That was interesting indeed. The late Dr. Stephen Harbury had served Rosehill for nearly 40 years before his son inherited the practice. Village doctors knew everything: births, deaths, affairs, scandals, and they carried secrets to their graves. "My mother apparently visited old Dr. Harbury the night she died," Evelyn said quietly. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Who told you that?" "Adrian Bell." "And your father knew Bell discovered this?" Outside wind stirred the willow branches above the lake. Miss Marple rose slowly and moved nearer the window. The surface of the water reflected the clouds with mirror-like calm. "How deep is the lake?" "Not very. 5 feet near the center." Miss Marple nodded. A healthy adult woman drowning accidentally in shallow ornamental water was possible, but not common. She turned back. "Did your mother know Dr. Harbury well?" "Everyone did." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I mean particularly well." Evelyn flushed faintly. "I don't know." That meant perhaps she did, or feared it. Before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, the door opened abruptly. Colonel Bryce entered. He stopped dead upon seeing Miss Marple. His face darkened instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" Evelyn straightened. "I invited Miss Marple."
"I see."
The colonel's tone suggested he saw considerably too much. Miss Marple smiled placidly. "Good afternoon, Colonel. I suppose the village has appointed you official investigator." "Oh, dear, no. Villages investigate themselves naturally." His eyes hardened. "I won't tolerate gossip concerning my wife." "Perfectly understandable. She died tragically. Nothing more." Miss Marple looked at him very steadily. Then why was Adrian Bell asking questions about her 27 years later? For one dangerous second the colonel's composure cracked. Real fear. Then anger rushed in to cover it. That man was a meddling fool. Possibly. He came prying into matters that were no concern of his, and discovered something? The colonel stepped toward her. "I advise you strongly, Miss Marple, to leave the past alone." There was genuine menace in his voice now. Evelyn whispered, "Father." But Miss Marple only sighed gently. "My dear Colonel, the difficulty with the past is that it rarely stays where one puts it." He stared at her. Then, abruptly, he turned and strode from the room without another word. The door closed heavily behind him. Silence lingered. Evelyn looked shaken. "I'm sorry." "There's no need. You see now why I'm frightened." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I believe I do." That evening Miss Marple took a slow walk through the churchyard before dusk. St. Jude's stood quiet beneath gathering shadows. The bell tower rose above her, ancient and watchful. Near the lych gate she encountered the vicar polishing his spectacles anxiously. "Ah, Miss Marple, you seem troubled." "Well—" he lowered his voice. "Inspector Graves asked to see old parish ledgers from 1919. How fortunate you still possess them." The vicar gave a nervous cough. "Actually, several pages are missing." Miss Marple stopped walking. "Missing?" "Torn out quite recently by the look of it." "How very curious." The vicar shifted uneasily. "There's another thing." "Yes?" "The bell rope." "What about it?" "It was replaced in 1920 after being badly damaged." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Damaged how?" "Nobody seems certain, but apparently it snapped during ringing one night." A faint chill touched her spine. "When exactly?" The vicar frowned, trying to remember. "I believe the same week Mrs. Bryce died." The evening bell began suddenly overhead. One slow, heavy toll. Then another. Miss Marple stood perfectly still, listening to the sound roll out across Rose Hill. And in that moment a small, terrible idea began forming clearly in her mind. Not merely murder, not merely concealment, but two crimes joined together across nearly 3 decades by the ringing of a bell. The following day dawned unnaturally bright after the rain, with sharp sunlight lying across the village green and smoke rising blue from cottage chimneys. Rose Hill looked peaceful again, almost offensively so. Miss Marple had long ago observed that murder seldom altered the appearance of a place as much as it altered its silences. People still spoke cheerfully enough in shops and lanes, but now conversation stopped abruptly when someone approached. Faces became guarded. Doors closed more quickly. And everywhere, beneath the ordinary life of the village, there was fear. Not fear of a stranger. Fear of someone known. Not fear of a stranger. Fear of someone known. At 11 o'clock, Miss Marple paid a call upon Dr. Harbury. His surgery occupied a converted red brick house near the edge of the village. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet coats, though no patients appeared to be present at the moment. The doctor himself emerged from his consulting room looking tired. "Miss Marple, my dear doctor, I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not particularly." He led her into the surgery office with the resigned air of a man aware he could not reasonably refuse elderly ladies without social consequences. Miss Marple seated herself neatly. "You look overworked."
"I am."
"And worried." Harbury glanced at her sharply. "You notice too much." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It's generally considered a fault." He gave a short laugh despite himself. Outside the window a gardener swept leaves from the pavement. Miss Marple said quietly, "Your father knew Clara Bryce well." The doctor's expression altered instantly. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It might." Miss Marple folded her gloves carefully. "My dear doctor, people become remarkably defensive when old names are mentioned." Harbury crossed toward the mantelpiece. "My father attended everyone in Rose Hill. That was his profession." "Indeed. But Mrs. Bryce visited him the night she died." A long silence. When Harbury finally spoke, his voice was flat. "You've been speaking to Adrian Bell's friends." "Only listening to the village." That can be worse." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It usually is." The doctor rubbed a hand wearily across his face. "My father kept notes on patients, detailed notes. Quite proper. After his death I inherited all his records." Miss Marple watched him steadily. "And someone has been looking for them." Harbury met her eyes abruptly. "What makes you say that?" "Because you are frightened." He said nothing. Miss Marple continued gently. "And because frightened people guard things." The doctor moved to his desk drawer almost unconsciously, a revealing gesture. "Very revealing." "There are some matters," he said slowly, "that should remain private or hidden." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what Bell was doing. He came here repeatedly. He questioned servants, searched records, stirred up things buried for years. Did he find what he was searching for?"
"I don't know."
But he did know. Miss Marple was certain of it now. Before she could press further, the surgery bell rang sharply downstairs. Harbury exhaled almost in relief. "I have patients waiting." Of course. As Miss Marple rose, she glanced once toward the desk drawer his hand had touched, and knew with absolute certainty that something important lay inside. That afternoon Inspector Graves visited Rosehill Manor. The event became known throughout the village within 14 minutes. By tea-time, speculation had reached extraordinary levels. At the Fox and Lantern, Mr. Simpkins announced confidently that Colonel Bryce would be arrested before nightfall. Mrs. Pritchard claimed Evelyn Bryce was secretly engaged to Adrian Bell. Young Peter Crammond insisted he had seen blood near the lake, though under questioning admitted it might have been berries. Miss Marple listened to all this with polite attention while taking tea with Mrs. Bantry. "My dear Jane," said Miss Eyes. Bantry eagerly, "Surely the Colonel must be involved somehow." "Possibly." That sounded very cautious. Caution is usually wise around military gentlemen. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "You think he killed his wife?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I think," she said slowly, "that people sometimes spend years protecting themselves from the consequences of a single moment." "That sounds ominous." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Life frequently is." Before Mrs. Bantry could pursue the matter, Florence entered hurriedly. "There's a gentleman asking for Miss Marple." "A gentleman?" "He wouldn't give his name." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. How mysterious. The visitor waited in the drawing-room. He stood with his back to the fire as Miss Marple entered, a tall man in a dark travelling coat, perhaps 50 years of age, with a narrow, intelligent face and nervous hands. He removed his hat. "Miss Marple." "Yes, my name is Edmund Bell, Adrian Bell's brother." There was a resemblance about the eyes now that she looked carefully. "How do you do, Mr. Bell? I apologize for arriving unannounced." "Not at all." He remained standing, visibly tense. "I came because of my brother." "Naturally. He wrote to me shortly before his death." Miss Marple became very attentive indeed. "Did he?" Edmund Bell reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope. "He asked me to come to Rosehill if anything happened to him." That, Miss Marple thought, was highly significant. He feared danger? "I believe so." Bell handed her a folded letter. "My brother said he had uncovered proof that a woman was murdered in Rosehill many years ago." Miss Marple read silently. "If matters become unpleasant, you must speak to no one except perhaps Miss Jane Marple, who understands human wickedness better than most policemen. The answer lies not in the lake, but in the tower. And beware the second bell." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "How interesting!" Edmund Bell sat down heavily. "What did he mean?" "That," said Miss Marple, as becoming clearer. He studied her anxiously. "My brother wasn't fanciful. If he believed himself in danger, there was reason. He told me someone in the village had concealed murder for 27 years. Miss Marple nodded faintly. "And now another murder has occurred to preserve the first." Bell stared. "You really believe that?" "My dear Mr. Bell," said Miss Marple quietly, "people will endure almost anything except exposure." He lowered his voice. "There's more." "Yes?" "Adrian discovered a connection between Clara Bryce and old Dr. Harbury." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What sort of connection?" Bell hesitated. "My brother believed they were having an affair." Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, somewhere down the lane, children shouted briefly before fading into distance. Miss Marple sat very still. Now at last the emotional shape of the thing emerged. Jealousy. Scandal. The oldest motives in the world. "Did your brother discover proof?" she asked softly. "I think so. But whatever he found is missing." "Missing?" "He kept a leather notebook. The police never recovered it." Miss Marple's mind moved quickly. Someone had searched Belcroft Cottage before Inspector Graves arrived. Someone searching not for money, but for evidence. Edmund Bell leaned forward suddenly. "Miss Marple, do you know who killed my brother?" She did not answer immediately, because quite suddenly another memory surfaced. Dr. Harbury's hand touching the locked desk drawer, protecting something, or fearing its discovery. Miss Marple looked toward the darkening window. "No," she said quietly, "but I believe I know who is lying." That evening, shortly after 9 o'clock, the second incident occurred. The church bell rang violently through the darkness, once,
Twice.
then stopped abruptly. The sound tore across Rose Hill like an alarm. Windows opened instantly. Lights flared across the village. Within minutes villagers were hurrying towards St. Jude's with coats thrown hastily over nightclothes. Miss Marple arrived more slowly, escorted by the anxious Mrs. Bantry. A crowd had already gathered before the church gates. Inspector Graves stood near the porch, speaking sharply to a constable. "What happened?" Mrs. Bantry whispered. No one answered. Then the vicar emerged from the church, white-faced and trembling. "Oh, dear God," he murmured. Miss Marple stepped forward. Inside the church, beneath the shadow of the tower staircase, lay Dr. Lionel Harbury. He was unconscious, blood staining one side of his head. Beside him, fallen upon the stone floor, lay a torn leather notebook. For several moments after entering the church, Miss Marple thought Dr. Harbury dead. The stillness of the body upon the flagstones had that dreadful finality which no village ever mistakes. Around her the gathered crowd remained hushed in collective horror while Inspector Graves knelt beside the fallen doctor. Then Harbury gave a faint, involuntary movement. A breath escaped several listeners at once. "He's alive," Graves said sharply. "Stand back there." The doctor's head had struck the edge of a stone step. Blood darkened the collar of his coat, though not in the dreadful quantity one might expect from mortal injury. Miss Marple's attention shifted immediately to the leather notebook lying nearby. Torn, not dropped accidentally. Several pages had been ripped out violently. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Graves looked up. "Constable Finch, clear the church." Reluctantly the villagers began retreating toward the porch, though with the unmistakable resentment of people denied further spectacle. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "My dear Jane, another attack. You think someone tried to kill him?" Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully upon the tower staircase. "No," she said quietly. "I think someone tried to frighten him." That, she reflected, was much more revealing. An hour later Dr. Harbury had been carried to his surgery and declared likely to recover, though concussed and heavily shaken. Inspector Graves established himself once more in the vicar's study, now transformed into the center of Rose Hill's mounting crisis. The torn notebook lay open upon the desk between them. Miss Marple examined it carefully while Graves paced. "Most of the written pages are missing," he said irritably. "Whoever attacked Harbury removed them before we arrived. But why leave the notebook at all? Perhaps they were interrupted." Graves frowned. "Or perhaps the pages mattered more than the notebook itself." "Exactly." He stopped pacing. "You think Harbury possessed Bell's missing evidence. My dear Inspector, I think Dr. Harbury has been terrified for days, and hiding something." Graves looked toward the damaged notebook. One remaining page contains only names. Miss Marple lowered her eyes. Written in hurried pencil were 4 entries. Written in hurried pencil were 4 entries. Clara Bryce, Stephen Harbury, bell midnight ringing, saw someone leaving tower. Miss Marple felt the small inward click that comes when disconnected fragments suddenly begin arranging themselves into shape. Not complete shape, but direction. "Inspector," she said softly, "who rang the church bell the night Clara Bryce died?" He blinked. "What?" "In 1919. Was it established?" "I don't know." "Because someone apparently saw a person leaving the tower." Graves stared down at the page. "You think Bell discovered a witness?" "Possibly. And now someone else knows." The inspector swore under his breath. Outside the vicarage windows, villagers still clustered in the lane despite the late hour. Fear and excitement had become inseparable now. Another attack, another warning, and once again the bell. Inspector Graves suddenly looked at Miss Marple sharply. "You said earlier the second ringing wasn't accidental." "No." "You still believe that?" "More strongly than ever." "Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because bells are messages, Inspector." He looked unconvinced. "Messages?" "Yeah." "In villages particularly. Bells announce danger, death, weddings, fire, celebration." She paused. "And sometimes guilt." The inspector rubbed tiredly at his forehead. You make it sound almost theatrical. My dear man, murderers are often intensely theatrical, especially when frightened. The following morning Rosehill awoke into open panic. People no longer pretended the violence belonged safely in the past. 2 attacks connected to the church bell could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Doors were locked earlier. Children were called indoors before dusk, and everyone watched everyone else. Miss Marple found this atmosphere extremely useful. Fear, she often reflected, loosened human behavior in much the same way heat loosened old glue. At 10:30 she received an unexpected visitor. Percival Wexford arrived at Rose Cottage looking exhausted and deeply miserable. He twisted his hat continuously in his hands. "Miss Marple, I wondered if I might speak privately." "Of course, Mr. Wexford." He sat nervously upon the edge of a chair. "I know people suspect me. I didn't kill Adrian Bell." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "I don't believe you did." His relief was almost painful to witness. "Thank God. But you have concealed something." The relief vanished instantly. Wexford stared. "My dear Mr. Wexford," said Miss Marple gently, "dishonest men are often transparent because they expect everyone else to behave similarly." He swallowed hard. "Yes," he whispered. After a long pause he said, "I took money from the Restoration Fund. I thought perhaps so. Only temporarily at first. Then things became worse." He buried his face briefly in his hands. Bell discovered discrepancies in the records, and threatened exposure? "No!" "That's just it." Wexford looked up desperately. He scarcely cared about the money after a certain point. Miss Marple became very attentive. What interested him instead? The old Bell records. Always the bell. Wexford licked dry lips. "There used to be a written log kept by church wardens whenever the bells rang outside regular hours. Weddings, deaths, emergencies. And Bell found something unusual." "What?" Wexford lowered his voice instinctively. "A midnight ringing on the night Mrs. Bryce died." Miss Marple sat very still. "Only one?" "That's the strange part." Wexford leaned forward anxiously. The log originally recorded 2 separate ringings. A small chill touched her spine. "The second entry disappeared later." "Removed deliberately?" "I think so." Miss Marple's mind moved rapidly now. 2 ringings. Twice. Always twice. Who had access to the records? Very few people. "Name them." Wexford hesitated. "The vicar." "Myself." "Bryce occasionally because of family memorial matters." He swallowed. "And Dr. Stephen Harbury years ago." Miss Marple looked at him sharply. "Why Dr. Harbury?" "Because after Miss Bryce died, there was confusion about the time." "Go on." "The bell ringing fixed the hour people believed she left the manor." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not symbolism, not superstition. The second bell had altered the timeline, just as someone had attempted during Adrian Bell's murder. She opened her eyes again. "Mr. Wexford, who discovered Mrs. Bryce's body?" Wexford looked startled. "Why, old Dr. Harbury." That afternoon Miss Marple walked slowly beside the lake at Rosehill Manor. Wind moved softly across the dark water beneath the willows. She paused near the stone edge where Clara Bryce had supposedly slipped 27 years earlier. A woman walking alone at midnight. A quarrel. A bell ringing twice. A doctor arriving first. Number. Not arriving first. Already there, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Human nature, she reflected, seldom changed its methods. Passion created panic. Panic created mistakes. And clever people frequently overestimated cleverness. Footsteps sounded behind her. Bryce approached slowly through the grass. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes, dear." Evelyn looked pale again, shadows dark beneath her eyes. "Is Dr. Harbury truly all right?" "He will recover." Relief flickered across Evelyn's face too quickly to escape Miss Marple's notice. "That was interesting." "You're fond of him," said Miss Marple gently. Evelyn flushed faintly. "And your father disapproves. How did you know?" "My dear child, fathers nearly always disapprove correctly and for entirely wrong reasons." Despite everything, Evelyn laughed softly. Then the laughter faded. "Miss Marple, did Lionel tell you anything?" "No." "He's frightened." Evelyn clasped her hands tightly. "He said Adrian Bell uncovered something terrible about our families." "Our families." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Not just the Bryces?" Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Lionel believed his father was somehow involved too." The wind stirred harder across the lake, and suddenly Miss Marple saw it clearly. Not merely adultery, not merely jealousy, but collusion. a shared secret carried across generations. She turned very gently toward Evelyn. "My dear, were your mother and old Dr. Harbury in love?" Evelyn's face changed completely. Not surprise, recognition. "Oh," she whispered. "Then you know," Miss Marple said quietly. "But I believe I am beginning to." Miss Marple slept very little that night. Age, she often thought, altered one's habits in peculiar ways. Young people imagined old ladies spent their evenings dozing peacefully beside fires. In reality, elderly minds frequently remained disturbingly active at 3 o'clock in the morning, especially when murder refused to arrange itself properly. She sat now in her small drawing-room before dawn, wrapped in a shawl while the fire burned low beside her. Outside, Rose Hill lay silent beneath drifting mist. The facts were there. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough. A woman dead in 1919, a doctor first upon the scene. A bell rung twice to alter the apparent time. And now Adrian Bell murdered after discovering the connection. But one thing continued troubling her deeply. If Clara Bryce had indeed been murdered, why conceal it so elaborately? Passion alone rarely sustained secrecy for 27 years. There was something more. At 8:30, Inspector Graves arrived unexpectedly, looking exhausted and irritable. "You were right," he announced without preamble. "My dear Inspector, that sounds most alarming." "About what?" "The Bell records." He removed papers from his case and spread them across the table. "We located an older duplicate ledger in diocesan storage at Canterbury. The original church log was altered." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "And the missing entry?" Graves tapped the page. 2 bell ringings recorded on the night Clara Bryce died. One at 11:40, another exactly at midnight. The official account later listed only the midnight ringing. Miss Marple nodded slowly, which moved the apparent sequence of events forward 20 minutes.
"Yeah, but why?"
She looked at him quietly. "Because someone needed Clara Bryce alive at midnight." The inspector stared. Then, slowly understanding, began crossing his face. "You mean the killer required witnesses to believe she died later than she actually did?" "Exactly." Graves sat down heavily. "Good Lord, people are very inventive when constructing alibis." He rubbed tired eyes. "And Harbury's father certified accidental drowning. Though if the death occurred earlier than believed, then certain people's movements become rather important." Graves looked sharply up. "You suspect Colonel Bryce?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead she asked, "Did you discover where Dr. Harbury was attacked from last night?" The inspector frowned.
"What?"
"No sign of forced entry. Was the bell rope disturbed?"
"Yes, actually."
Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Then the attack was staged, to frighten Dr. Harbury into silence, not kill him." Graves looked unconvinced. "He suffered a serious head injury, but not a fatal one." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. "If someone truly wished him dead, Inspector, they would hardly choose a crowded churchyard with bells ringing loud enough to summon the entire village." He stared at her for a long moment. "You think Harbury knows the truth?"
"Oh, yes."
"And someone believes he may speak. Then why doesn't he?" Miss Marple looked into the dying fire. "Because loyalty," she said softly, "is sometimes more dangerous than guilt." By midday the village hummed with fresh rumors following news of Dr. Harbury's attack. The latest theory placed secret passages beneath St. Jude's Church. Another involved wartime espionage. Mrs. Pritchard insisted there was something foreign about the whole affair. Miss Marple ignored all this and walked instead toward the old schoolhouse lane. There lived Mrs. Eliza Morton. At 83, Mrs. Morton had spent nearly her entire life in Rose Hill, and possessed the sharp memory common among village women who survive everyone else. She received Miss Marple in a dim parlor smelling strongly of lavender polish. "Murder again," Mrs. Morton announced at once. "Knew there'd be trouble sooner or later." "You expected it?"
"Oh, yes."
Miss Marple accepted tea while Mrs. Morton settled herself with evident satisfaction. "You remember Clara Bryce well?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Morton snorted. "Whole village remembered Clara Bryce. Beautiful creature. Men lost their senses over her. And Colonel Bryce? Possessive as a chained dog." Miss Marple said nothing. Encouraged, Mrs. Morton continued. "People said she regretted marrying him almost at once. Did they?"
"Oh, yes."
Then there was the doctor. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Dr. Harbury?" "The old one, naturally. Stephen Harbury." Miss Morton lowered her voice instinctively, despite there being nobody to overhear. "Everyone knew he was in love with her. And she with him? Mrs. Morton hesitated. The word hung quietly between them. Did Colonel Bryce know? My dear Miss Marple, said Mrs. Morton dryly, husbands always know. They simply pretend not to until they can no longer bear it. A remarkably accurate observation. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. The night Clara Bryce died, Mrs. Morton's expression altered. For the first time genuine unease entered her face. Yes? The bell rang unexpectedly.
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Morton gripped her teacup tightly. How did you know that? Miss Marple did not answer. Instead, she said softly, You heard it? A long silence followed. Then Mrs. Morton nodded slowly. Tell me. The old woman stared toward the window where autumn light rested pale upon the garden. I couldn't sleep that night. Heard the first ringing before midnight. Strange violent ringing. Then later another ... She swallowed. People came out into the lane because of it. Did you see anything? Another silence. I saw Dr. Harbury crossing the churchyard. Miss Marple became perfectly still. Before or after the second ringing? Before. There it was, not arriving afterward. Already moving between tower and manor before midnight officially struck. Mistress Morton whispered. He looked frightened. Did anyone else see him?
I don't know.
But you told nobody. The old woman gave a bitter little laugh. In villages, dear lady, one learns when silence is safer. Miss Marple sat quietly for several moments. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did Clara Bryce die by accident? Mrs. Morton's hands trembled slightly.
No, she whispered.
The room seemed suddenly colder. How do you know? Because she came here earlier that evening. Miss Marple stared. She visited you? Crying terribly. Mrs. Morton lowered her eyes. She said she meant to leave the manor. Leave Colonel Bryce? She said she was afraid of him. Outside, somewhere down the lane, children shouted faintly in play. The ordinary sound felt strangely distant. What happened then? Miss Marple asked softly. She left after 11. Said she was meeting someone near the church. Dr. Harbury? I suppose so. Mrs. Morton twisted her handkerchief anxiously. The next morning she was dead in the lake. Miss Marple's mind moved with terrible clarity now. Clara Bryce intended to leave her husband. She arranged to meet Stephen Harbury. Something happened before midnight. Then someone altered the timeline with the second bell. Not an accident, not suicide, murder. But whose? Miss Marple rose slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Morton. The old woman caught her sleeve suddenly. There's one more thing. Yes? After Clara died, Colonel Bryce and Dr. Harbury were never enemies. Miss Marple looked at her sharply. They should have been, Mrs. Morton whispered. But they weren't. And suddenly the final shape of the old crime began emerging from the mist. Not rivalry, not revenge, something far stranger. Not rivalry, not revenge, something far stranger, something shared. That evening Inspector Graves summoned Miss Marple privately to the vicarage. His expression was grim. We found the missing notebook pages. Miss Marple sat down quietly. Where? In Dr. Harbury's surgery. Hidden? Graves handed her several worn pages covered in Adrian Bell's cramped handwriting. One passage had been heavily underlined. Stephen Harbury falsified time of death, not to protect Bryce, to protect Clara's child. Miss Marple felt a sudden sharp tightening in her chest. Graves looked bewildered. What child? But Miss Marple was no longer listening fully, because at that moment she understood at last why silence had endured for 27 years, and why Dr. Harbury had been willing to risk everything rather than speak. For a long time after Inspector Graves handed her Adrian Bell's recovered pages, Miss Marple remained perfectly silent. The vicarage clock ticked steadily in the corner. Outside, rain had begun again, tapping softly against the dark windows. Inspector Graves broke the silence first. What does it mean? Miss Marple looked down again at the underlined sentence. Stephen Harbury falsified time of death, not to protect Bryce, to protect Clara's child. She folded the pages carefully. It means, she said quietly, that we have misunderstood the relationships involved. Graves frowned. You think the child was illegitimate. My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple gently, villages are built upon illegitimacy, usually discreetly. He ignored this. Whose child? Miss Marple did not answer immediately because the conclusion forming in her mind felt almost unbearably sad. At last she said, Not Colonel Bryce's. The inspector stared. Good God! Rain whispered harder against the panes. And Stephen Harbury knew? Oh, yes. Then the affair was real. I think so. Graves paced toward the fireplace. Then Bryce discovered it and killed his wife. Perhaps. That seems fairly obvious. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. Not obvious. He turned impatiently. What else could it be? My dear Inspector, obvious explanations are nearly always incomplete where human beings are concerned. She rose carefully and crossed toward the window. The difficulty, she said softly, is that if Colonel Bryce murdered Clara in jealous rage, why would Stephen Harbury help conceal it? Graves opened his mouth and stopped. Miss Marple turned back. A man may conceal his lover's disgrace, she continued. He may even conceal her accidental death, but helping her murderer preserve an alibi for 27 years. She shook her head. Human nature does not behave quite so tidily. Then Harbury himself killed her?
No.
You sound certain.
I am.
Why? Because he spent the rest of his life protecting someone. Miss Marple lowered her eyes briefly. People protect guilt differently from love. Dr. Harbury regained consciousness the following morning. Inspector Graves questioned him immediately, though the interview proved frustrating. The doctor lay pale against the pillows in his upstairs bedroom while autumn light filtered weakly through the curtains. I remember entering the church, he said wearily. Then someone struck me from behind. Did you recognize them?
No.
Why were you carrying Adrian Bell's notebook? Harbury hesitated too long. I found it. Where? In Belcroft Cottage. And concealed it from police? The doctor closed his eyes briefly. Why? Another silence. Miss Marple sat quietly near the window knitting. At length Harbury said, Because my father was involved. Inspector Graves leaned forward sharply. In Clara Bryce's death?
How?
Harbury swallowed. My father altered the official timeline. We know that. He claimed Clara died shortly after midnight. Harbury's voice had become strained now. But he knew she was already dead before the second bell rang. Why conceal that? Harbury looked away. To spare scandal. Inspector Graves gave an impatient exclamation. After 27 years you still expect us to believe that? Harbury's face tightened. You don't understand Rosehill. No, said Graves coldly. Explain it to me. The doctor looked suddenly exhausted. My father believed exposure would destroy lives. Miss Marple spoke quietly for the first time. Evelyn Bryce. Harbury looked at her sharply. There it was. Inspector Graves frowned. What has Miss Bryce to do with this? Harbury said nothing. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. My dear Inspector, she said gently, suppose Evelyn Bryce was not Colonel Bryce's daughter. Silence crashed into the room. Harbury stared at her. Graves looked utterly stunned. You mean... The doctor closed his eyes. My father believed Evelyn was Stephen Harbury's child. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Not Stephen. Interesting slip. Very interesting indeed. Graves recovered first. And Bryce knew? Harbury nodded faintly. Not at first, but Clara intended to leave him eventually. For your father? Then Bryce confronted them?
No.
The word burst from Harbury almost violently. Too violently. Miss Marple's needles paused softly in her lap. Inspector Graves noticed it too. What do you mean, no? Harbury breathed unevenly. You're constructing the wrong picture. Then give us the right one. The doctor looked suddenly terrified. Not cautious, terrified. Miss Marple knew then that they stood very near the center of the truth. Later that afternoon Miss Marple walked alone through the churchyard. The air smelled of wet leaves and damp stone. Above her the bell tower rose dark against low drifting clouds. She entered the church quietly. Inside, St. Jude's stood empty except for the faint scent of candle wax and ancient wood polish. Miss Marple moved slowly toward the tower staircase. She had avoided climbing it thus far for obvious reasons. Medieval stairs and elderly knees were uneasy companions, but now she felt certain the answer lay above. Very carefully she began the ascent. The narrow spiral staircase wound upward into gloom. Dust lay thick along the stone edges. Somewhere overhead ropes creaked faintly in the draught. Halfway up she paused to catch breath. Then she noticed something curious. A small scratch upon the wall. Not recent, perhaps, but deliberate. She leaned closer. Initials, C.B. Below them, much fainter. Miss Marple became very still. Two lovers climbing secretly to the tower long ago. Not the lake, the tower. Bell had written, "The answer lies not in the lake, but in the tower." She continued upward. The bell chamber itself was dim and cold, filled with the heavy bronze silence of the bells above. Dust drifted through narrow slits of light. Miss Marple looked slowly around. Then she saw it. Near the far wall stood an old wooden cabinet used for storing maintenance tools and bell records. One hinge hung loose with age. Someone had forced it open recently. Inside lay only scraps of paper and broken rope, but beneath them a woman's glove. Very old, faded blue silk. Miss Marple lifted it gently. Embroidered inside were tiny initials, C.B. Clara Wright. Her mind moved swiftly now. Clara met Stephen Harbury secretly in the bell tower. Someone interrupted them. There was struggle, perhaps panic violence. Then later the second bell altered the timeline. But still something remained wrong. Because if Clara died in the tower, how did she reach the lake? Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, and suddenly saw it. Not murder planned, accident concealed. Her eyes opened sharply.
Oh, dear.
That evening she requested Inspector Graves and Dr. Harbury meet her privately at Rose Cottage. The doctor arrived looking weak but deeply anxious. Graves came carrying Adrian Bell's notes. Rain battered softly at the windows while Florence served tea no one touched. Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think," she said quietly, "we have all misunderstood Clara Bryce's death." Harbury went pale instantly. Graves leaned forward.
Go on.
"Clara did not die at the lake. She died in the church tower." Harbury's face drained of color completely.
My God,
Graves whispered. Miss Marple turned gently toward the doctor. She met Stephen Harbury there secretly. They were lovers. Harbury said nothing. They argued perhaps, or someone else arrived unexpectedly. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "There was a fall." The doctor shut his eyes. "An accident," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not murder." At last Harbury whispered, the word barely audible. Inspector Graves stared. "Then why conceal it?" Harbury looked suddenly broken. "Because Colonel Bryce found her there." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Now at last everything aligned. "He discovered the affair," she said, "and realized Evelyn was not his child." Harbury covered his face with trembling hands. "My father panicked." Harbury covered his face with trembling hands. "My father panicked. Of course he did." The doctor spoke through his fingers. "Bryce wanted scandal avoided at any cost. My father wanted Evelyn protected. So together," his voice faltered, "they moved Clara's body to the lake." Inspector Graves stared in disbelief. "They staged accidental drowning." "And the bell?" "My father rang it again at midnight," Harbury whispered. To alter the timeline, silence settled heavily over the room. Rain whispered against the windows. Then Graves said slowly, "But Adrian Bell discovered all this, and someone killed him to keep it hidden." Harbury looked up suddenly.
No.
Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Number, not fear now," the doctor whispered. "You still don't understand." And Miss Marple realized with cold clarity they had uncovered the old crime, but not yet the modern murder. For several moments after Dr. Harbury spoke, nobody moved. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Rain drifted against the windows of Rose Cottage. Somewhere downstairs Florence could faintly be heard rattling teacups with disapproving energy. But within the drawing-room itself there was only silence. Miss Marple looked steadily at Dr. Harbury. "You mean Adrian Bell was not killed to conceal Clara Bryce's death?" The doctor's voice sounded exhausted now, as though years of strain had finally become unbearable. Inspector Graves frowned sharply. "That makes no sense. Bell uncovers the truth, then turns up murdered in the church tower." "Because he discovered something else," Harbury said quietly. Miss Marple felt the small inward tightening that always came when truth approached suddenly. Something else, of course. Human beings rarely stopped after one deception. Lies bred fresh lies with almost agricultural enthusiasm. She folded her hands. "What did Adrian Bell discover, Doctor?" Harbury hesitated. "That Clara Bryce was not the woman meant to die." Silence fell again. Inspector Graves stared.
Why?
Harbury looked toward Miss Marple instead of the inspector. "My father told me the truth shortly before he died," Miss Marple said softly. "Go on." The doctor swallowed hard. "On the night Clara died there were 3 people in the tower, not 2. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed faintly. "Colonel Bryce." Harbury shook his head. "Another woman." The room seemed suddenly colder. "Who?" Graves demanded. Harbury closed his eyes briefly. "My mother?" Miss Marple did not move, but inwardly the entire structure shifted violently into new shape. Stephen Harbury's wife, of course. A village doctor's wife overlooked by everyone. Invisible women often stood nearest the center of tragedy. Harbury spoke with painful slowness now. My father and Clara planned to leave Rose Hill together. My mother discovered it." His voice tightened. "She followed Clara to the church. Miss Marple saw it instantly. The hidden meeting, the confrontation in the tower, jealousy, humiliation, rage. Not Colonel Bryce after all. Mrs. Harbury." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "You're suggesting your mother killed Clara Bryce?"
No!
Harbury's head came up sharply. "That's the point." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her knitting. "An accident," she said softly. The doctor looked at her almost gratefully. Rain whispered harder against the windows. "My mother confronted Clara in the bell chamber," they argued. Clara slipped near the stairs. His face had gone gray. She struck her head. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Not murder. Not quite. But death born from passion all the same." "And Stephen Harbury arrived afterward," she said quietly. "He realized scandal would destroy everyone involved. My father believed it would ruin Evelyn completely, because the child's parentage would become public." Harbury nodded. Inspector Graves said sharply, "Then where does Colonel Bryce fit into this?" The doctor gave a weary, bitter laugh. "Bryce arrived before midnight. My father confessed everything." He paused. "And Bryce made a decision." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "He agreed to conceal the truth." That question mattered, and suddenly Miss Marple understood. Not kindness. Bryce could not bear public humiliation. Better a dead wife than a faithless one exposed before the village. So the body became a drowning victim, and the bell rang twice to rewrite time itself. Harbury whispered, "My father always believed he had damned himself that night." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I expect he had." Inspector Graves left shortly afterward to verify portions of Harbury's account. The doctor remained behind, looking utterly spent. Miss Marple poured fresh tea quietly. "You've carried this knowledge a long time, since my father died, and Adrian Bell discovered it independently." Harbury stared into the fire. "He came to me 3 weeks ago. At first he only suspected the timeline had been altered. Then he found letters." Miss Marple looked up. "Letters between Clara Bryce and your father?" "Where?" "In the tower cabinet." The cabinet Miss Marple herself had searched. Harbury continued, "My father hid them after Clara's death, and Bell found them." Miss Marple considered this. If Bell uncovered the truth of Clara's accidental death, why was he murdered? Harbury's face altered again, fear returning. "Because there remained one final thing. One letter," he said slowly, "mentioned another name." Miss Marple waited. "Lionel?" The room seemed to contract around them. "My father wasn't the only Harbury involved," the doctor whispered. Miss Marple felt cold certainty settle over her. "Not Stephen Harbury, the son." "You were already born," she said softly. Harbury nodded. "My mother believed my father intended to abandon us. He looked sick now. But the truth was worse. Clara Bryce intended to leave with you." The doctor shut his eyes. Miss Marple understood at last. Not lovers fleeing together. A child at the center. Lionel Harbury himself. Clara. Bryce had loved the boy almost as her own. Stephen Harbury's marriage had long been unhappy. Clara meant to take Lionel away with them when she left Rose Hill. Mrs. Harbury discovered the plan, and followed her to the tower. Such small human things, jealousy, humiliation, fear of losing a child, enough to destroy lives for decades. But still Adrian Bell's murder remained. Miss Marple said quietly, "Who else knew this?" Harbury looked suddenly stricken. "My mother? Alive? Here in Rose Hill? She lives at Ashcombe Lodge outside the village." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did Adrian Bell speak with her?" A terrible silence followed. Then Harbury whispered. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Eleanor Harbury the following afternoon. Ashcombe Lodge stood beyond the lower fields, half hidden among overgrown hedges. The house itself possessed the faded melancholy of somewhere inhabited by memory rather than life. Mrs. Harbury received her in a dark sitting-room smelling faintly of coal dust and lavender water. She was a small, elegant woman in her late 70s, with silver hair and remarkably steady eyes. Too steady, Miss Marple thought. Women who survived terrible things often learned stillness as armor. "You've come about Adrian Bell," Mrs. Harbury said immediately. The older woman smiled faintly. "My son warned me you might." "Did he?" "He said you notice truths people prefer hidden." Miss Marple settled quietly into a chair. "Did Adrian Bell visit you?" "What did he ask?" "About Clara Bryce." Mrs. Harbury folded delicate hands in her lap. "He already knew most of it." "And what did you tell him?" Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Which truth?" For the first time the older woman's composure flickered. "That Clara's death was an accident, and that you were present. No hesitation. Interesting again." Miss Marple said softly, "Were you afraid Belle would expose everything?" Mrs. Harbury laughed quietly. "My dear Miss Marple, at my age exposure loses much of its terror. But not for your son." A shadow crossed the woman's face. "No." Lionel feared scandal. He feared destruction. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Why?" Mrs. Harbury looked toward the dark window. "Because Lionel loved Evelyn Bryce." There it was, of course. Love again. Always love at the center. "They intended to marry," Mrs. Harbury said softly. "But if Belle exposed the truth, they might discover Evelyn was Stephen Harbury's daughter." Miss Marple became very still, because something about that sentence was wrong, subtly wrong, not emotionally, factually. Mrs. Harbury continued, "Lionel believed exposure would ruin Evelyn utterly." Miss Marple looked at her carefully now, very carefully indeed. Then she asked quietly, "My dear Mrs. Harbury, are you absolutely certain Stephen Harbury was Evelyn's father?" For the first time since the conversation began, Eleanor Harbury looked afraid. Real fear, and Miss Marple knew immediately. They had finally reached the true secret buried beneath Rosehill for 27 years. Eleanor Harbury did not answer immediately. The silence stretched softly through the dim sitting-room while rain moved against the windows, and somewhere upstairs an old clock ticked with slow, deliberate patience. Miss Marple watched the woman opposite her very carefully. Fear altered people differently. Some became loud, defensive, emotional. Others grew still. Eleanor Harbury had become absolutely motionless. At last she said quietly, "No." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "No," repeated Mrs. Harbury, "I am not certain." There it was, the final uncertainty around which 27 years of guilt, secrecy, and death had revolved. Miss Marple spoke gently, but everyone assumed it, Stephen Harbury included. Mrs. Harbury gave a faint, bitter smile. "My husband wanted to believe it, because he loved Clara Bryce." Outside, wind stirred faintly through the hedges. Miss Marple said softly, "And Colonel Bryce?" The older woman looked away. "He never truly knew." A curious answer. Not denial, not confirmation. Miss Marple's mind moved delicately through the possibilities now assembling themselves into a far darker pattern. "Tell me about Clara," she said. For several moments Eleanor Harbury remained silent. Then, unexpectedly, her expression softened. "She was very young," she murmured. "Far too young to marry Bryce. Men admired her because she listened so beautifully. She made people feel important." A shadow crossed her face. "That is a dangerous gift in women." Miss Marple nodded quietly. She liked admiration, perhaps too much. Eleanor clasped her hands together tightly. "But she was not wicked." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I don't think she was." The older woman looked toward the fire. "When Stephen fell in love with her, I knew almost at once. Villagers teach women to notice such things." She gave a brittle little laugh. "One survives marriage by learning observation." Miss Marple said nothing. "But Clara—" Eleanor paused. "Clara was lonely." "And afraid?" "Of Bryce?" Again the hesitation. Still not complete truth. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "Did Clara love Stephen Harbury?" Mrs. Harbury's eyes flickered. "I think she wanted someone to rescue her. Not the same thing." Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened further. "And did he?" "What?" "Rescue her!" The older woman closed her eyes briefly. "No." Silence settled again. Then Miss Marple asked the question that truly mattered. "Whom did Clara Bryce intend to meet in the tower that night?" Eleanor Harbury opened her eyes sharply. For the first time genuine alarm crossed her face. "My husband." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I don't believe so." The older woman stared. Miss Marple continued quietly. "Stephen Harbury arrived afterward. He concealed what happened. But I think Clara expected someone else entirely." Rain whispered harder against the glass. Eleanor's composure began to crack almost visibly now. "You're wrong." "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "one grows very old listening to human beings. Eventually one notices when grief and love do not quite align properly." The older woman looked suddenly exhausted. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She was meeting Bryce." Miss Marple felt the final pieces slide sharply into place. Not lovers meeting secretly. Husband and wife. At the tower. At night. The affair with Stephen Harbury had mattered. but not in the way everyone assumed. Miss Marple spoke carefully now. Clara intended to leave Rose Hill, and Bryce discovered it. He demanded she meet him before she left. Mrs. Harbury nodded faintly. Why the tower? Brivecki. They used it sometimes during village events. A bitter little smile touched her mouth. People overlook church towers surprisingly easily. They did. Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. What happened? Eleanor Harbury stared into the fire. I followed her. Not Stephen. Not jealousy of an affair. Jealousy of a marriage. The older woman whispered. I thought if Bryce persuaded her to stay, perhaps Stephen would come back to me properly. Such small, desperate hopes. Miss Marple felt suddenly very tired. There was an argument, Eleanor said. Terrible shouting. Bryce accused... There was an argument, Eleanor said. Terrible shouting. Bryce accused her of humiliating him. Clara said she would take Evelyn away. Her voice trembled now. Then Bryce struck her. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not an accident, after all. Murder. The truth settled heavily between them. Eleanor continued in a broken whisper. She fell against the bell-rope mechanism. I heard the bell ring once. Tears stood suddenly in her eyes after all these years. Then she fell down the stairwell. Not pushed deliberately, perhaps, but struck. Miss Marple said quietly, and Stephen Harbury arrived afterward. He realized Bryce would hang. He realized Evelyn would lose everything. Eleanor pressed trembling fingers to her lips. Stephen loved that child, though she was not his. The older woman looked up sharply. No, she whispered. Miss Marple became perfectly still. At last, no? Eleanor Harbury shut her eyes. Evelyn was Bryce's daughter. The room seemed suddenly colder. Not Stephen Harbury's child. Colonel Bryce's all along. Then why? Miss Marple saw it instantly. The affair had been emotional, perhaps, even romantic, but not physical. Or not certainly so. The entire village had constructed scandal from appearances and longing. Stephen Harbury believed Evelyn his child because he desperately wished Clara loved him completely. Bryce believed it possible because jealousy poisoned certainty, and Clara herself perhaps never corrected either man. How very human, how extraordinarily tragic. Miss Marple said softly, So Stephen concealed the crime believing he protected his own daughter, and Bryce allowed it because exposure would reveal his violence. Eleanor nodded miserably. The second bell? Stephen rang it at midnight to alter the timeline. Miss Marple sat quietly absorbing it all. At last she said, Adrian Bell discovered the truth, and came to you. Did you tell him Bryce killed Clara? Eleanor Harbury's face changed. Not grief now. A much fresher fear. No. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. You're lying. The older woman gave a small, broken sound. No one can prove. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, Adrian Bell was murdered because someone feared precisely what he learned from you. Eleanor Harbury stared at her, then suddenly whispered, Bryce heard us. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. He overheard your conversation with Bell. When? 3 days before the murder. There it was, the trigger. Did Bell confront him afterward? I think so. And Bryce realized Bell knew the truth. Eleanor nodded faintly. Miss Marple rose slowly. At last everything aligned. Clara. Bryce murdered in rage. Stephen Harbury concealing the crime out of misguided love. The Bell altering time itself. And Adrian Bell killed because he uncovered the original murder. Simple. Terribly simple. Yet one thing still troubled her. Not the crime. The killer. Because Colonel Bryce did not seem like a man frightened enough to panic. Number. If Bryce killed Adrian Bell, it would have been deliberate. Which meant Miss Marple stopped moving suddenly. A thought so sharp it almost felt physical passed through her mind. Not panic, planning. And planning meant something else entirely. She turned back slowly toward Eleanor Harbury. My dear Mrs. Harbury, she said softly, when exactly did Colonel Bryce learn Bell intended to publish the truth? The older woman blinked. I don't know. But someone else did. Miss Marple's eyes had become very distant now, because suddenly she understood something dreadful. Bell had not been murdered to conceal the past. He had been murdered to preserve the future. Miss Marple walked back to Rose Hill through gathering dusk with her mind moving very quickly indeed. The village lay quiet beneath low grey clouds. Lamps glowed warmly behind curtained windows. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent again. Ordinary sounds, ordinary evening. Yet now the truth stood dangerously near. Not the old truth, the new one. Adrian Bell had discovered Colonel Bryce killed Clara Bryce in rage 27 years earlier. That alone explained fear, secrecy, and perhaps desperation. But not the manner of Bell's murder. Not the careful manipulation of time. Not the staged confusion surrounding the bell. And not the terrible precision with which suspicion had shifted from one person to another. Those things required calculation. Miss Marple's thoughts returned suddenly to Evelyn Bryce. Fear, not grief. Always fear. And another memory surfaced. Lionel believed exposure would ruin Evelyn utterly. Why ruin her? Scandal alone could not explain such terror in modern England, not after nearly 3 decades, unless something practical depended upon it, something immediate. Inheritance. Miss Marple stopped walking beneath the yew trees near the churchyard. Of course, Rose Hill Manor. Colonel Bryce had no other child. If Evelyn's legitimacy were questioned publicly, everything altered. Property, title, succession. Human beings, Miss Marple reflected sadly, would endure almost any moral corruption rather than financial uncertainty. She turned at once toward the manor. Inspector Graves arrived there shortly after she did. The colonel received them in the library with visible irritation. "You arrive very late for social calls." Miss Marple noticed immediately that he looked older tonight. Not frightened precisely, but strained, as though maintaining control required increasing effort. Inspector Graves wasted little time. "We've uncovered new information regarding your wife's death." Colonel Bryce's face hardened.
I see.
"You struck Clara Bryce in the church tower." The colonel poured whiskey carefully into a glass. "I wondered when that would surface." No denial. "You admit it?" Graves demanded. "I struck her during an argument. She fell." His voice remained flat. "I never intended to kill her." Miss Marple watched him steadily. "And afterward?" Harbury arrived. A bitter smile touched Bryce's mouth. Poor fool. He still imagined himself noble. He altered the timeline and moved the body. The colonel drank slowly. "All of you seem remarkably shocked, yet villages survive through concealment. Without it, every decent family would collapse within a generation." Miss Marple said softly, "You feel no remorse?" For the first time something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt. Weariness. "I lived with it every day, but not enough to confess." Bryce looked at her sharply. "My confession would have destroyed Evelyn." "There it is," said Miss Marple quietly. The colonel went still. Inspector Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple turned toward him. "Colonel Bryce has spent 27 years convincing himself concealment was an act of paternal protection." Bryce said coldly. "It was." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It was self-preservation." Silence settled heavily across the library. Then the colonel laughed once, a hard, exhausted sound. "You really are an intolerable old woman." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "People often say so." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Did Adrian Bell confront you?"
When?
"The afternoon before he died, and he threatened exposure." Bryce's jaw tightened. "He intended publication, thereby endangering Evelyn's inheritance." The colonel stared at Miss Marple sharply. Inspector Graves said slowly, "You killed Bell to stop him."
No.
The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed faintly. Bryce continued, "I considered it. God help me, I considered it very seriously. But I did not kill him." "Why should we believe that?" "Because Bell left here alive." The colonel crossed slowly toward the fireplace. "I warned him. Nothing more." Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was truth there. Not complete truth, perhaps, but enough. Colonel Bryce had concealed one death, yet strangely she no longer believed he committed the second. Inspector Graves remained unconvinced. "You expect us to accept that?" Bryce gave a tired shrug. "Believe whatever you like." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "What happened after Bell left the manor?" The colonel hesitated. Evelyn followed him. The room changed instantly. Inspector Graves looked sharply up. "Why?" "She overheard part of our conversation." Miss Marple felt cold certainty stir again. Fear, not grief. Always fear. "What exactly did she hear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Bryce looked away. "That I killed her mother. And Bell intended to expose it publicly." Inspector Graves said sharply, "Where did Miss Bryce go afterward?" "I don't know." But he did know something. Miss Marple could see it plainly now. Not guilt. The same protection that had poisoned Rose Hill for decades. Not guilt. The same protection that had poisoned Rose Hill for decades, she asked softly. Did Evelyn meet Belle at the church? The Colonel's silence answered before he spoke. After leaving the manor, Inspector Graves stopped abruptly beneath the churchyard gate. You think Evelyn killed Belle? Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the dark tower.
No.
But she met him. Then what happened? Miss Marple folded her shawl more tightly around herself against the cold. My dear Inspector, young women raised amid secrecy become extraordinarily vulnerable. You think Belle threatened her?
No.
Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I think he frightened her. Graves frowned. That's a distinction without meaning. Oh, no, said Miss Marple softly. Human motives depend upon such distinctions. They walked slowly across the green. The church bell marked the quarter hour overhead, one heavy note through darkness. Miss Marple stopped walking again, because another memory had surfaced suddenly. Dr. Harbury attacked beside the torn notebook, not killed, warned, someone desperate not to expose old truths, yet unable to commit deliberate murder a second time. Not Bryce, not calculated enough, and not Evelyn either. Miss Marple looked up sharply.
Oh, dear.
Inspector Graves noticed. What is it? She spoke almost absently now. We have misunderstood the sequence entirely. What sequence? The murder. Graves stared irritably. Miss Marple, Adrian Bell died because two people confronted him separately. He blinked.
What?
One in anger, one in fear. Her eyes had become distant and very sharp, and only the second believed herself guilty. The inspector stared. Miss Marple turned slowly toward him. My dear man, Evelyn Bryce thinks she killed Adrian Bell. At 10:30 that evening, Evelyn Bryce arrived at Rose Cottage. She looked exhausted, pale beneath the hallway lamp, her gloves damp from mist. Miss Marple received her quietly by the fire. For several moments Evelyn could not speak. Then suddenly, Father told me you know. The girl closed her eyes briefly. He said you discovered the truth about Mother. Yes, dear. Evelyn sat down heavily. All my life, she whispered, I knew something terrible lived inside this house. Miss Marple waited. When Adrian Bell told me Father killed her, Evelyn's voice shook. I thought I should go mad. And you met Bell afterward. At the church. Evelyn nodded faintly. Miss Marple said gently, Tell me exactly what happened. The girl pressed trembling fingers together. He was waiting in the tower. He tried to explain everything calmly. Tears stood in her eyes now. He said Father struck Mother accidentally. That Dr. Harbury helped conceal it. And you? I was angry. Frightened. She swallowed hard. I accused him of wanting scandal. Did he?
No.
Evelyn shook her head violently. He said the truth mattered. Always disastrous in villages. What happened then? Miss Marple asked softly. I left him alive. Miss Marple felt a quiet inward certainty. That much was true. But later, Evelyn whispered, I heard the bell ring. Twice. I went back. Her face had gone white now. He was already lying there. Miss Marple said very gently, And you believed he was dead. Was anyone else present? Evelyn hesitated. Then very softly. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. Dr. Harbury. He was kneeling beside Bell. Evelyn's voice trembled violently now. There was blood everywhere. Lionel looked at me and said, You must leave immediately. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Now at last she understood everything, not one concealment, and once again love standing at the center of destruction. Evelyn whispered, I thought Lionel killed him to protect me. Miss Marple opened her eyes slowly. My dear child, she said softly, I do not think Lionel Harbury killed Adrian Bell either. And in that moment she knew exactly where the truth had been hiding all along. The following morning dawned pale and cold, with a thin white mist drifting across Rose Hill Green. Miss Marple sat beside her drawing-room window, holding a piece of knitting she had not touched for nearly 20 minutes. Such neglect of wool was always a sign of serious mental activity. Florence entered carrying tea. You've scarcely slept, miss. No, said Miss Marple absently. Murder is very interrupting. Florence, accustomed to such remarks, merely adjusted the tray. They're saying in the village that Colonel Bryce will be arrested today. And poor Miss Evelyn's been crying terribly according to Miss Eyes Finch. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Yes, quite understandable. After Florence departed, Miss Marple remained still for several moments longer. Then suddenly she smiled, a small, almost apologetic smile. Hydrangeas. How curious that the solution should arrive through hydrangeas. It had happened before. Human wickedness often resembled gardening problems unexpectedly. One merely required the correct comparison. Miss Marple rose immediately and sent a note requesting Inspector Graves come at once. The inspector arrived looking tired, muddy, and increasingly impatient with Rosehill altogether. "You said it was urgent." Miss Marple indicated a chair. "You've been considering this case incorrectly, Inspector." He gave a short laugh. "I'm delighted to hear it. You have assumed Adrian Bell's murder resulted from discovery of the past. Obviously, the past merely frightened people. The murder itself concerned the future." Graves rubbed his forehead. "You said that before. But now I understand precisely how." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tell me, Inspector, what was Adrian Bell actually intending to do?" "Publish the truth about Clara Bryce's death, and what would happen afterward. Bryce disgraced, Harbury scandalized, Evelyn Bryce's legitimacy questioned."
"Ah,"
said Miss Marple softly.
"There."
The inspector frowned.
"Why?"
"But not disproved." Graves blinked. Miss Marple continued gently. "My dear Inspector, everyone behaved as though Evelyn's parentage were uncertain. Yet uncertainty alone does not destroy inheritance. Legal legitimacy in England is remarkably resilient." The inspector stared. "Then why panic?" "Exactly." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. "Someone believed Bell possessed proof." "Proof Evelyn wasn't Bryce's daughter," Graves said slowly. "But according to Eleanor Harbury, she was. I believe Eleanor told the truth." The inspector frowned harder. "Then Bell's publication changes nothing. Legally? Probably very little. Then why murder him?" Miss Marple leaned back quietly. "Because someone misunderstood the danger, and there it was, the final piece." Inspector Graves looked at her sharply. "You think the killer acted on false assumptions?" Miss Marple said softly, "Lionel Harbury." The inspector stared. "But you said—" "I said Lionel did not kill Bell in the church tower." Graves went still. Slowly he said, "Meaning Bell wasn't murdered there." Miss Marple nodded. "My dear Inspector, Adrian Bell died before the second bell rang." The room seemed suddenly very quiet. Graves spoke carefully now. "The body was found in the tower, but the fatal wound was not caused there." Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "The church scene was staged, just as Clara Bryce's death was staged 27 years earlier." The inspector swore softly under his breath. "Good God! You're certain?"
"Oh, yes." "How?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hydrangeas." Graves stared helplessly. "My dear lady, what in heaven's name have hydrangeas to do with murder?" Miss Marple said patiently, "At Rose Cottage my hydrangeas always stained terribly if bruised after rain. Adrian Bell's coat carried fresh blue-purple marks on the right sleeve." The inspector blinked. "So? There are no hydrangeas near the church, but there are several large bushes outside Dr. Harbury's surgery." Graves sat perfectly still now. Miss Marple continued gently. "Bell visited Harbury the evening he died. We know that already. What we fail to realize is that he never truly left alive." The inspector's face changed completely. "You think Harbury killed him during an argument?"
"No."
"Then who?" Miss Marple looked into the fire. "I think Bell collapsed unexpectedly during confrontation." "Collapsed?"
"Yeah."
"Perhaps struck during struggle. Perhaps his head hit furniture." She paused. "But not deliberate murder." Graves frowned intensely. "Then why move the body?" "Because Lionel Harbury believed Bell was dead and believed Evelyn responsible." Silence crashed between them. Miss Marple spoke very softly now. "Bell confronted Colonel Bryce first. Evelyn overheard. Later she followed Bell to Harbury's surgery seeking explanation." She paused. "There was argument. Bell fell. And Harbury arrived." The inspector's voice had become hushed. "He thought Evelyn killed Bell accidentally." "Exactly. And repeated his father's mistake." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "History is very persistent in villages." Graves rose abruptly.
"My God."
He moved Bell's body to the church tower, rang the bell twice to confuse the timeline, then intended suspicion to fall elsewhere. The inspector stared toward the window. "And the attack on Harbury? Self-inflicted in part, I think, or at least arranged." Miss Marple sighed faintly. "Conscience becomes difficult to manage after a while. But Bell died from the fall?"
"No."
The inspector turned sharply. Miss Marple's face had grown grave now. "That," she said quietly, "is the final tragedy. Dr. Harbury received them in his surgery shortly after noon. He looked exhausted before they even spoke." Inspector Graves closed the door firmly behind them. Adrian Bell came here the night he died. Harbury said nothing. Miss Marple watched him gently. "My dear doctor," she said, "you've been protecting Evelyn Bryce exactly as your father once protected her mother." The color drained slowly from Harbury's face. "You understand, then?" The doctor sank heavily into a chair. "He came to tell Evelyn the truth. She became distraught. Bell tried calming her." Harbury pressed trembling fingers against his forehead. "Then Bryce arrived unexpectedly." Miss Marple listened carefully. "Another argument? What happened?" Bell slipped. Harbury swallowed hard. "He struck the corner of my desk," Inspector Graves said sharply. "And died." "No." Harbury looked up miserably. "He was unconscious only." Miss Marple felt cold sorrow settle quietly inside her, because now she knew. The doctor whispered, "I thought he was dead." Inspector Graves stared. "So you moved the body?" "To protect Evelyn." "Then who killed Bell?" Harbury shut his eyes. "When I carried him into the tower, he regained consciousness. The room seemed suddenly frozen." Miss Marple said softly, "And someone else was already there." The doctor looked at her in horror. "Colonel Bryce." Harbury nodded faintly. "He followed us." Inspector Graves swore violently. Harbury's voice shook now. Bell tried to speak. Bryce panicked. He covered his face briefly. He pushed Bell backward near the stairwell. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The same tower, the same fear, the same fatal violence repeated across generations. Harbury whispered. Bell fell exactly where Clara Bryce fell. Silence filled the surgery. At last Inspector Graves said coldly, "So Colonel Bryce murdered Adrian Bell deliberately?" "No," said Miss Marple quietly. Both men looked at her. She sighed gently. "My dear Inspector, he murdered him the same way he murdered Clara Bryce." Graves stared. In anger, in panic, in terror of exposure. Miss Marple folded her hands softly together. Some people spend their lives believing they concealed one terrible moment successfully. Outside, the church bell began to ring faintly across Rosehill. "One day," Miss Marple said quietly, "they discover they have been repeating it ever since. Colonel Bryce was arrested at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Rosehill observed the event from behind curtains, garden hedges, and discreetly opened front doors. By supper the entire village possessed a detailed account of the arrest, though unfortunately no two accounts resembled one another in the slightest. Mrs. Pritchard insisted the colonel had attempted escape across the lower fields. Mr. Simpkins maintained there had been a violent struggle. Young Peter Crammond claimed confidently that Scotland Yard itself had arrived in 3 motor cars. In reality, Colonel Bryce accepted arrest with exhausted calm. Inspector Graves later described it to Miss Marple with visible discomfort. "He scarcely reacted at all," the inspector admitted. "Just asked whether Evelyn knew." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "That sounds rather like him. He denied intending Bell's death." "I expect he did." Graves looked impatient. "Miss Marple, the man pushed Bell down a church staircase." "Yes," she said softly. "But intention and panic are curious companions." The inspector snorted faintly. "You're extraordinarily charitable toward murderers." "No," said Miss Marple. "Merely realistic. That evening the village existed in a state of almost unbearable excitement. Lamps burned late in cottage windows, while neighbors crossed lanes carrying improbable errands merely to exchange information. At Rose Cottage, however, the atmosphere remained subdued. Evelyn. Bryce sat beside the fire with clasped hands and hollow eyes. She had not cried once since arriving that afternoon. Miss Marple considered this unsurprising. Great shocks often produce silence before grief. Dr. Harbury stood near the window, pale and drawn after his confession to Inspector Graves. The strain of the previous days seemed suddenly to have aged him years. For some time nobody spoke. Then Evelyn said quietly, "Did father confess?" Harbury answered before Miss Marple could. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Everything?" "Enough." Silence again. Closed her eyes briefly. "Everything?" "Enough." Silence again. Outside, evening mist drifted slowly across Rosehill Green. At last Evelyn whispered, "He loved me." Miss Marple looked gently toward her. "Yes, dear, I think he did. Even after believing—" Evelyn stopped. "That you might not be his child?" Evelyn nodded faintly. Miss Marple folded her knitting softly. "Human beings are very curious about blood," she observed. "Yet love often behaves much more stubbornly." Harbury looked down suddenly. "My father loved you too." Evelyn turned toward him. For the first time in hours, real emotion crossed her face. "All those years," she whispered, "everyone living inside lies." The doctor's voice sounded broken now. "My father destroyed himself protecting people. Then I repeated it without even thinking." Miss Marple sighed gently. Families are sadly inclined to inherit mistakes as though they were silverware. Despite everything, Harbury gave a faint, helpless laugh. Evelyn looked toward Miss Marple suddenly. "When did you know?" "My dear, one never truly knows. One only notices. But what made you understand about Lionel?" Miss Marple considered. "The attack in the church." Harbury looked up sharply. "What about it?" "You rang the bell before anyone arrived." The doctor stared.
How?
"My dear man, frightened people seeking help ring once continuously. You rang twice." She smiled faintly. It was imitation rather than instinct. Harbury sank slowly into a chair. "I suppose I wanted someone to understand." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think perhaps you did." The trial at Medchester Assizes began 6 weeks later beneath intense public interest. Reporters arrived from London. Rosehill endured the indignity of appearing in newspapers for nearly a fortnight, which many villagers secretly enjoyed while publicly condemning it. Bryce pleaded not guilty to murder, but the facts proved devastating. Adrian Bell's notes, Dr. Harbury's testimony, the concealed history of Clara Bryce's death. Yet throughout the proceedings one thing struck Miss Marple repeatedly. Bryce never attempted fully to excuse himself. He admitted striking Clara Bryce during rage. He admitted helping conceal her death. And he admitted pushing Adrian Bell during confrontation in the tower. But always he described events with the same weary refrain. "I only meant to stop everything from collapsing." In the end, the jury convicted him not of murder, but manslaughter. The newspapers debated this fiercely for days. Miss Marple was not surprised. English juries, she reflected, understood panic rather better than morality. Winter came early to Rosehill that year. By December frost silvered the hedges each morning and smoke curled steadily from cottage chimneys. The village slowly reclaimed its ordinary rhythms, though not entirely. Some wounds altered places permanently. The manor stood shuttered now except for Evelyn's private rooms. She intended eventually to sell it. Dr. Harbury resumed practice quietly, though much changed in manner, gentler somehow, and older. One afternoon shortly before Christmas he came to take tea with Miss Marple. Snow threatened beyond the windows. "You were kinder to me than I deserved," he said suddenly. Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "My dear doctor, kindness has very little to do with deserving." He stared into the fire. "I nearly destroyed Evelyn's life trying to protect her, and repeated my father's sins exactly. Families often do." Harbury gave a short laugh. "You make human nature sound hopeless." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Merely repetitive." Silence settled comfortably between them for a moment. Then Harbury asked quietly, "Do you think my father was wicked?" Miss Marple considered carefully before answering.
No.
The doctor looked surprised. "He concealed a death, falsified records, lied for decades." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "But wickedness, in my experience, is usually colder than that." "What was he then?" "A weak man trying desperately to preserve people he loved." Harbury looked toward the falling dusk. "And Bryce?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Colonel Bryce spent 27 years believing concealment would save him from one terrible moment." She paused softly. "But guilt does not remain still. It grows." Outside, church bells drifted faintly through the winter air. Harbury listened. "I shall never hear bells the same way again." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "Nor will Rosehill." Christmas Eve arrived bitterly cold and clear. The village gathered that night at St. Jude's for carols beneath candlelight. The church glowed warmly against the snow while voices rose gently into the ancient rafters. Miss Marple sat beside Mrs. Bantry near the back pews, wrapped in her best wool coat. "How peaceful it seems again," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "But you're thinking something melancholy." "My dear Lucy," said Miss Marple softly, "villages are rather melancholy places underneath." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Whatever do you mean?" Miss Marple looked toward the bell tower high above them. "In villages," she said gently, "people know one another too long. They remember old griefs, old shames, old loves." She smiled faintly. "And sometimes they spend entire lives protecting secrets no longer worth protecting." The organ swelled softly. Candles flickered across stone and stained glass. Then, overhead, the bell of St. Jude's began to ring for the midnight service. Only once. Miss Marple listened carefully, and for the first time since coming to Rosehill the sound carried no fear at all. Snow remained upon Rose Hill for nearly a week after Christmas. The village looked transformed beneath it, roofs powdered white, hedgerows softened, the green lying smooth and untouched beneath pale winter light. Even old scandals appeared gentler under snow. Miss Marple always thought winter revealed English villages rather truthfully. Summer allowed roses and fêtes and cheerful distractions. Winter exposed structure, and structure, like character, mattered very much indeed. On the final afternoon of the year, she sat with Mrs. Bantry beside the drawing-room fire at Gossington Hall while dusk gathered softly beyond the windows. Mrs. Bantry poured tea. "Well," she declared, "I still think the whole business was extraordinarily tragic." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Most murders are, but not always so." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Lucy, murder is nearly always sad once one removes the excitement people wrap around it." Miss Bantry considered this while buttering toast thoughtfully. "I suppose there never really was a villain." "Oh, I wouldn't say that exactly. Wouldn't you?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Colonel Bryce chose violence twice. One mustn't excuse that merely because fear accompanied it." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Yes, poor Evelyn." Indeed. For a little while they listened to the fire. Then Mrs. Bantry asked the question that had clearly occupied her for days. "What do you think Clara Bryce was really like?" Miss Marple looked into the flames. "Charming," she said softly. "Lonely, perhaps. Very young. And careless?" "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "People sometimes imagine carelessness harmless when they are attractive. It rarely is." Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. "She made several people unhappy." "Yeah. Though I don't think she intended cruelty." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Unfortunately, intention matters much less than consequence." Outside, snow began falling again in slow silver flakes. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "And Stephen Harbury, a weak, romantic man. That sounds severe." "My dear, romantic people often do dreadful damage because they mistake emotion for morality." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "You really do understand people alarmingly well, Jane." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I simply remember." There was silence again. Then Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "One thing still puzzles me." "Yes? Why did Adrian Bell become so determined? Most historians would simply note inconsistencies and move on." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Because he cared about truth." "That sounds admirable." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, "and dangerous." Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "Dangerous." "My dear Lucy, truth disturbs arrangements. Villages survive through arrangements." Outside, bells drifted faintly across the snowy evening as the church prepared for New Year's service. Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "I shall never hear bells comfortably again." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I think you will. Human beings recover astonishingly fast from horror." She paused delicately. "Often much too fast." The following morning Miss Marple received a letter from Evelyn Bryce. The handwriting remained elegant, though less steady than before. Miss Marple read it slowly beside the window while Florence dusted the mantel with energetic disapproval of all tragic subjects. At length Florence asked, "Bad news, Miss—" "No." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "Miss Evelyn has decided to leave Rose Hill." Florence paused. "Can't say I blame her." "No." "She marrying the doctor, then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Florence, life is not quite so tidy as novels." Florence sniffed. "Should be." After she departed, Miss Marple unfolded the letter once more. "Dear Miss Marple, I think perhaps Rose Hill has held too many ghosts for too long. Lionel and I shall go abroad for a time after the trial concludes entirely. I cannot decide whether I feel relief or grief most strongly. But I wanted to thank you, not merely for discovering the truth, though heaven knows someone had to eventually, but for helping me understand that the lies were never truly about me. I think that matters very much." Miss Marple read the final line twice. Then she placed the letter gently beside the fire. That did matter, because children raised inside secrecy nearly always believed themselves responsible for it somehow. A terrible burden. That afternoon Miss Marple took one last walk through Rose Hill before returning to St. Mary Mead. The village lay quiet beneath winter sunlight. Smoke curled upward from chimneys. Somewhere a gardener chipped ice from a pathway. Ordinary life again. At St. Jude's Church she paused beneath the tower. The bell rope hung motionless now in the cold air. Miss Marple stood very still for several moments, so many lives altered by fear of exposure. Clara. Bryce wanting escape, Stephen Harbury wanting impossible romance, Eleanor Harbury wanting her husband back, Bryce wanting possession disguised as dignity, Lionel and Evelyn wanting freedom from inherited shame, and Adrian Bell wanting truth. Miss Marple sighed gently. Human beings always imagine truth simple and cleansing. Usually it was neither. The vicar emerged from the church carrying hymn books beneath one arm. "Ah, Miss Marple, good afternoon. You're leaving us tomorrow, I hear. We shall miss you." He hesitated. "Though perhaps Rosehill may hope for quieter days now?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear vicar, villages are never quiet underneath." He laughed uncertainly, then glanced upward toward the tower. "I confess I still dislike hearing that bell after dark." Miss Marple followed his gaze. The winter sky beyond the stone arch looked pale and distant. "Yes," she said softly, "but perhaps now it may ring honestly again." The vicar looked puzzled by that, though too polite to ask